last year I did this whole series on the secret powers of meditation, and I, there were 10 of them. And some of you were there, many of you I think were, and you might recall what were some of them. Let's see if anyone remembered anything. You can turn your mic on or post those in the chat if you like.
The secret power of silence.
Right, that was the very first one. Thank you. And yeah, the secret power of sight. Yeah, but that was just called this. I call the whole series is called the secret powers of meditation, and each one is the power of something. So the first one was the power of silence, and then others
The power of love.
of which
Of love.
of love. That's right. That was the end one. Of course, that's the jewel in the crown, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it kind of brought it all together. And there were lots in between. I remember there was the power of breath, and there's a whole lot of what I was doing with a lot of these was taking the perspective of as a yogi. Okay, how does silence play a part in my life or our lives as meditators? But also, what about silence and the way that human beings experience silence, what it does for them, how it affects us physiologically when we can't get silence, which is a problem nowadays. We're not designed to live in such a noisy environment, and what sort of research is there showing how the sort of impact that has on us. So I'm sort of bringing together what, a kind of a bit of the modern understanding of these different phenomena. Habits was another one, the power of habits. The power of breath, yeah, that was a lot of neat research on that. And power of intuition, the power of perspective. So there's a bunch of those. And there were 10 that I did last year. And I've actually got another 10 at least, which I'm exploring and thinking of using. And I'm going to make a video series based on this for the Bliss Timer app. But it was actually a couple of days ago, on the weekend, I gave a workshop as a part of a big New Year's weekend event, or 4-day event with Anandamaga members from around mostly North America and the Caribbean and Latin America. And I thought I would play with this idea of the whole concept of power and mental powers. And I've decided to call that the weird stuff. Okay, so that's me being weird again. And we're going to play with these a little bit. Okay, so nowadays, as you probably know, I teach a lot of people who are very much in the the world of business and the world of commerce and technology, very practical, and they have a lot of stress. So one of the main sort of outcomes that most of them are looking for, at least in the beginning, from their meditation is to reduce their stress and be less anxious and be more focused and all of these. And then some of them thinking, okay, this will make me more clear-minded and maybe more creative or intuitive. So those are the kind of outcomes they're looking for. When I started meditating, actually one of my main... Well, let me step back a minute. Long before I started meditating, I had this obsession with flying since I was a little kid. I don't remember when I first did it, but you know how on your birthday, or at least in New Zealand, we have this tradition. When you have your birthday as a child, you're granted a wish. There's this allotment of one wish, and you get the wish, but only if you blow out all of the candles on your cake, and you're not allowed to tell the wish to anybody, or it won't work, apparently. So I had this wish every birthday. This went on for 10 years. I wished that I could fly. Or sometimes I would wish that I was a dragon, but dragons can fly, at least these dragons can fly, so that kind of came with it. So basically every birthday I wished secretly that I could fly. And I did get a little disillusioned after 10 years of this not working. But then when I came across, this desire to pursue the spiritual path and figure out what enlightenment is or whatever that is, when that happened to me, then I learned that according to legend, some yogis, very advanced yogis, actually can fly. This is some figure from Tibetan legend. His name was Milarepa. And Milarepa was a real person. He had certainly seemed to have extraordinary powers of mind and a lot of amazing stories about him, including this story that in the later part of his life when he kind of, there's a long complicated story, but he became, very elevated literally and had the ability to fly through the air. So I thought, this looks cool, maybe I can do this. So I was still interested in learning in flying, right? So my actual hope was that through meditation I would be able to eventually be able to fly. And then I came across this path of Anandamaga that I follow now, and the guru of Anandamaga didn't really approve of this kind of thing. He said, this is, and so he discouraged. He said, even if this sort of power, I mean, it seems to be extremely rare, if that, at best. But if this sort of power does arise naturally through your meditation, you shouldn't exercise it, because you'll develop some feeling of superiority. I mean, imagine if you could really fly. It'd be almost impossible not to feel like you're kind of special, right? So he didn't think this was very healthy, sort of spiritually, psychologically. So he was sort of pretty much against this kind of thing. So I was thinking, well, that's not much. I was a little disappointed, but I thought I did understand that there are more important things. And ever since, I've been having these recurring dreams. I've had recurring dreams about flying since I can remember. It varies, but there's sort of similar. There's recurring parts of it. But now they had a new element, because in the new version of my recurring flying dreams, I could fly, and sometimes some dreams I'm sort of better at it than others. So some of them I'm really good at it, but I'm not supposed to do it, and so. But I still do it. So I do believe that at least on a subconscious level, I am not immune to the temptation of the power of being able to fly. So there you go. So that's my silly story. I would like to ask you all a question. Well, hang on. No, we'll go. Yeah. Okay, here we go. The idea of having some kind of superpower, it's not just my private obsession. Lots of people have this obsession, right? I'm going to ask you in a minute what kind of magical or miraculous special powers you might have wished for at some time in your life. Maybe not now, but certainly when we're young, I think most of us do. That's why these kind of stories, of course, we've got some are from mythology. So you have Lakshmi. I'll introduce you to these various supernatural figures. Lakshmi is up on your right. She's the goddess of wealth from the Hindu tradition. Of course, you'll no doubt recognize Harry Potter, an interesting religious figure. Wonder Woman, of course, Yoda, one of my favorites. There's Tara down on the left, the Buddhist goddess, a Tibetan Buddhist. I can't remember what she's the goddess of, but she's pretty important. And then, of course, Thor, who is both an actual Norse god and a modern superhero. So he's kind of versatile. And Black Panther, who was pretty cool, and sadly this wonderful actor died last year. So what kind of power did you fantasize about at some point in your life? You can forget about this Jamboard. I just want you to write these in the chat, okay? So let me see what powers you would love to have had at some point when maybe you don't think it's possible anymore, but at some point in our lives most kids, we go thinking, yeah, magic's for sure. We read about wizards and magic words and healing power. Okay, flying. Oh, this is getting greedy. Karun. Gosh, flying, healing, and teleporting. Okay, conjuring food from nothing. Kauri, Kauri, the wonderful cook. For those of you who don't know, a professional chef, I should say. Flying, Kailash, you too. Yeah, flying's a common one. Humans have been obsessed with this one for a pretty long time, I think. And of course, we project this stuff, right? So if you look at, all these gods and goddesses, and especially the really fantastic ones, they are conjured up by human imagination. So we act out our fantasies through our religion. Kauri's also had a flying when she was young. This is interesting to see how common this really is. Let's have a few more. To speak many languages, that's pretty neat. That's really cool. I have frequent dreams of being a much better musician than I am. I don't know if that counts. but it's certainly wishful thinking being acted out in my subconscious. But I don't think it's quite a superpower, but it feels like it sometimes. Teleporting, another teleporter here. Okay, what about? I'm glad to see that none of you, at least, are admitting to having some desire to have some sort of black magic. Being able to harm people in some sort of weapon or something. Like throwing thunderbolts. That's a little bit aggressive. Probably not a healthy sign. We're going to settle this. So we've got, all right, teleporting, many languages, flying, conjuring food. That's a first. Then the kind of job lot here: flying, healing, teleporting, healing, and then my flying. Okay, conversing with animals. Oh, I love that. Magic potions of life forever. Okay, we're getting creative. Well, that you're a creative man, a filmmaker. Okay, this is cool. All right, I've only just started doing this. This is the only second time I've run this bit of this workshop, and I'm finding it quite interesting that the variety and of wishes for powers that we humans come up with, and we're all or regular human beings, and yet so I come across a lot of people in my little slightly unusual profession, I suppose I would call it, as being a monk, a profession, life calling. Okay, I come across other strange people. I'm a little unusual myself, but I come across a lot of strange people, and I often end up, well, not so much recently, I've often ended up at a kind of psychic fairs. The kind of thing you go along and there's people with maybe healing people, and then you've got astrologers and all these different kind of new age kind of things, and somehow meditation is sometimes seen as a part of that, though meditation's hardly new age. It doesn't get much older than new meditation. But so I found myself in these situations, and one of them, I remember I was in Australia, and some of you might have told this story. I was in Australia and I had a student, I remember her name was Tina or something, and she had another teacher as well. So I was teaching her meditation. She was coming to our group. But she had this teacher who was a kind of psychic. And she would tell me about this teacher, and I just kept my mouth shut because I couldn't say anything negative, because that wouldn't be very constructive and, wouldn't help. But I didn't like what I was hearing very much, because I felt that, I got a pretty strong feeling that this psychic lady was kind of a charlatan of some kind. But I got to meet her. So I went to this esoteric fair, and at the fair, Tina was there, and she introduced me to her psychic guru or teacher or whatever she was, the psychic lady. The psychic lady was there, and she was, well, I can't really talk. I'm there all in my orange robes, and she's there in her purple robes with a big kind of scepter, or what would it be? A kind of staff with a big purple amethyst, purple stone in it. And she's looking... My impression was that she took herself rather seriously, and she had I'm taking a little liberty here to be a little mean to this woman, I'm afraid. She had a kind of disciple or student with her who seemed to be assisting her. So Tina introduces us, and the psychic lady, whose name I forget, said something which was, she was clearly saying that she knew what I was thinking, and it seemed like she was trying to impress her student and Tina, and like that she knew. I guess she was trying to assert her dominance in this realm or something. But what she said, so I said, but she said it in a way that it wasn't direct, like she was sort of saying, like as if it was obviously she knew what I was thinking. And so I like to be upfront with things. I said, are you saying you know what I'm thinking? And she said, well, of course. And I said, well, can you tell me what it is? I'm curious to know how accurate you are in this. So she was, of course, hoisted upon her own petard, as they say. She was gone, and she had to say, well, she said something or other that she thought I was thinking, and it was literally something I'd never thought of in my life. And so I said, well, that's really completely inaccurate. And she kept trying to insist now that she was right. Get this, that she knew what I was thinking and I didn't. So that was peculiar. And I anyway, I extracted myself from the conversation without being too rude. You'll be happy to know. And I actually ended up being invited to her centre, not by her. I think she was away or something. If she'd known it was me, she probably wouldn't have approved it. But some of her students invited me to give a talk there about chakras or something. And I came there, and it had a sign on a notice board, and it said, psychic readings, $25. And then it said, for students, students get a discount, $15. And then in brackets, please bring ID. And I was thinking, what kind of psychic is she if she doesn't know whether the student's really a student or not? And this seemed fairly basic in terms of what the psychic should know. So I thought that was pretty funny. I wish I had a photo of that, actually. So I come across a lot of people who, in my assessment, are either deluded or are trying to fool other people about their supposed psychic powers. I mean, a lot. I've come across, they're far more common, in my experience, far more common than people who actually have something. This is my favorite billboard. I remember driving around the Bay Area. This was, I can't remember where I drove past it. These billboards were all over the US. Some fraud or self-deluded person had told their followers that the Judgment Day is going to be on May the 21st of 2011, upon which suddenly nothing happened. And and these are expensive. This was a cheap one. There's a small one. Some of them were like these giant billboards by the freeway. It cost, I don't know, hundreds, thousands of dollars probably. So that was pretty embarrassing. And I've met a number of people who have prophesied the end of the world, end times or whatever, in different parts. I was in New Guinea, and I remember a young woman I met, and she seemed really bright, and I said, she spoke really good English, and I said, at university, and she said, well, I was, but I left university because, according to our pastor, she was a Seventh-day Adventist, I think, according to our pastor, we're in the end times. So there's no point in going to university because end times is going to happen in the next year or something. So I better just to stay home with my mum and spend time with my mum. And I thought, my God! And of course that would have been around 1988. So she missed out on her university education because of some foolish dogma that was erroneous. So, I really think trying to prophesy the end of the world doesn't seem smart to me, because if you want to build a reputation as a prophet, right, you want to be right. You want people to know that you're right. Now, if you predict the end of the world, this is a lose-lose proposition, because if you're right, the world ends and nobody ever knows that you were right. So you never become a famous prophet. And if you're wrong, everybody knows that you were wrong. There's no winning formula here, as far as I can tell. So, unless you get a partial end of the world, which seems, I don't know, awkward. So I like making fun of these people because I feel that some of them mislead people and mess up their lives. This is a really great film. This is from a film by Steve Martin. You can see there. It was called Leap of Faith. Very, very good film. And we got a comment in the chat here. Yeah, called Leap of Faith. And what he was doing, so Steve Martin, he has his views, and he doesn't like. He was exposing charlatans by pretending to be one. So he was taking the role of one of these preachers in some parts of the US. They'll have this big thing with music and then a lot of prayers and stuff, and then they'll apparently heal people in front of the crowd. But there are many instances of these being exposed as frauds, complete fraud. The whole thing is a conjuring trick designed to make money and exploit people's faith, which I think is really really wrong. I mean, it's kind of sacrilegious to me because they come there in sincerity, and these people are using that to manipulate them. And also creating, if they finally figure it out, what's going to happen? They're not going to trust perhaps the genuine person that comes along to help them or guide them or teach them. So this is harmful on many levels. So he made this great movie. It's a hilarious movie, and it's making fun of this guy that he's playing, who's the preacher. And at one point he comes up in front of the big crowd, and he says, he's such a great actor. He says, "I feel a healing coming on," and it's a high point of the movie for me. So I've got a question about this, which we'll come back to in a minute because I have to. So my question for you is, what's your opinion, actually? Is any of this psychic powers stuff for real? Or is it all fake? I mean, there's definitely plenty of fake stuff out there. In India as well. I know there's stories that, well, there are standard tricks that these charlatan so-called yogis or magicians will go to a village and make a big thing of. Maybe usually the village people, maybe they're uneducated. They see this yogi, they think he's a holy man. They come to him for help, right? And if there was one that was actually documented, a journalist managed to observe the thing. He went in disguise, and what happened was the holy man came, and there was a woman there who had lost her mind. She was very mentally disturbed. And he did this whole thing where he said she's possessed by a spirit, an evil spirit, and he did a big ritual, and he said, "I'm taking the spirit out of her and putting it in this coconut." The coconut's sitting there, and he did his ritual, and then after the spirit apparently went to the coconut, and he kind of poked the coconut just to see if say hello to the spirit or something. The coconut started moving. And it started moving all by itself. And everyone's freaked out. And they, "Oh my God, the spirit's in the coconut." They're afraid. And then he did some more ritual and he killed the coconut, or he burned the coconut or something. The journalist, he knew what the trick was. This crooked yogi, supposed yogi, had there was a mouse inside the coconut. And once he prodded the coconut, mouse starts running around, the coconut starts moving, and everyone thinks it's a spirit. So these are simple conjuring tricks that many people use to exploit people. And of course then he asked them that he got rid of the spirit, and I don't know if the poor young woman felt any better or not, but then they give him some money, and that goes on a lot. So what I want to know is if you think there is any genuine version of this, or is it all just people tricking people's incredulity, taking advantage of their incredulity, their openness to believing things that maybe aren't true. Any thoughts? Has anybody ever experienced anything? Okay, here we go. Anna Sheila. "I'm very skeptical, but I think some individual experiences are specifically meant for that individual, so I wouldn't discount it yet. I don't fully believe it." Okay, thank you. Let's take them one at a time. What do you think about telepathy? None of you actually mentioned telepathy. That was one of mine. I forgot to put it there. Telepathy, I really wanted to be able to communicate with other people just by thinking. That was one of my childhood passions. So I want to know if you think it's for real. So, Anna Sheila, you think telepathy is for real. Anybody else? What's your opinions about telepathy? Yes or no? Has anybody ever experienced it? I'd love to hear from you. If you feel free to turn on your mic if we're just a small group. If you've ever experienced telepathy. Karun, okay, do you have an example? Have you got a story for us?
Well, the classic is you think of somebody and then they call.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah. Or I remember a friend, we were once saying, "Did you feel something at I forget the details, but 3 o'clock yesterday afternoon?" And we both had.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, I'm just sending a psychic message to my friend downstairs who's drilling something. Let's see if it works. Okay.
I got an example. It's like when you finish people's sentence,
Oh
or
yeah.
even sometimes not even like they could utter like one word and you could finish like the last 5 words. Like there's some sort of weird connection going on.
Mhm.
I've experienced this like multiple times.
Okay. Interesting. Any others? So Advaita, you're saying you believe in telepathy. Okay. You've experienced it, I believe. I think that's what you're saying. I didn't really make the question clear. Let's try another one. What about something a bit more dramatic? Telekinesis. So telekinesis is the power to move physical objects only with your mind. Not involving neural nets or anything like that. This is purely mental.
I don't believe that.
Uh-huh. Okay, so there's more doubt about telekinesis. Like, Uri Geller was apparently, he could bend, famous for bending spoons with his mind and stuff like that. What about the ability to pass through walls? Don't believe in being able to pass through walls, okay? Or what about lots of us wanted to fly. Is it possible? There's a whole organization, the Transcendental Meditation Movement. They were charging people tens of thousands of dollars to teach them some advanced yogic techniques, fancy mantras and stuff, which apparently meant they could fly. And they did this for years and continue to do it to this day, I believe. And somebody challenged them, said, I'll give $1 million to anyone that can fly in front of me, and we can film it. And that money has never been claimed. Michael Jordan, very good. Well, if Cassius Clay, Muhammad Ali could float, right? That's a near thing. There are some amazing athletes who seem to be able to defy gravity, that's for sure. But it's not quite what I'm talking about. Okay.
Only in your dreams.
Pardon?
Only in your dreams.
Yeah, we've all, many of us.
Or if you have one of those jetpacks, you've seen those those guys that are like flying around LAX with jetpacks on. They're like flight hazards now.
Oh boy. I've seen film of them, the modern jetpacks. Jetpacks have been around for a long time, but the new ones are really cool.
They're really cool.
Yeah, probably really dangerous too at this point, but I'm sure they'll get better. Yeah, so we all want to fly. Wouldn't it be nice to just, what is it? Thinking is the best way to travel. Okay, quiz question. Which famous musical group is that lyric from? Thinking is the best way to travel. I'm showing my age. If you're not my age, you'll probably never get it. Maybe you haven't even heard of them. If you've heard of the Moody Blues, they had a lot of these kind of spiritual, psychic stuff in their songs and lyrics. Okay, so this picture is here because this is a photograph of Totapuri. Now he was a yogi, lived in India, and I believe he died maybe 60 years ago or something like that. But he apparently was like more than 200 years old. And he was believed to have extraordinary powers. And when the British came to India, and they sort of found this yogi, he lived in Varanasi, he was naked. He didn't wear clothes. There's a particular cult of yogis that don't wear any clothes because they say they're called sky clad. So he's wearing the sky. That's what he feels is the spiritual thing. So the British didn't like that, and that was against law. So they made the law and brought the law with them, and they wanted to put the yogi in prison. So they put him in prison, and every time they put him in prison, the next day he was out there meditating, doing whatever he wanted. And they could not figure out how to keep him behind bars. So they gave up after a while. And he used to meditate sometimes underwater for hours at a time. And this is really well documented. I mean, he wasn't secret about it. It was like everybody knew. And he'd sit on the bottom of the river and he'd meditate for hours. Or sometimes he could eat any amount of food he'd never need to stop. Or sometimes he could just go without food for indefinitely. He had seemed extraordinary powers. I just put him there as an example of someone who does seem to have had at least some of these powers. And there's also stories of him being able to walk on water. So he is by no means unique. There are thousands and thousands of sort of stories about these people who have these kind of powers, especially in India, but in other countries and traditions as well. The more difficult ones, like flying, are more rare because that seems to be very, Wim Hof. He does stuff with breathing and develops some extraordinary control over the vital energy of the body. So we can look at that in a minute. So, yeah, I'll explain a bit about what the perspective on this is from yoga. This is just one facet of it. There's a whole lot of stuff about mental powers and that in yoga philosophy, which I normally don't teach about because I don't want people to be bothered with it because it's not really the objective. But to give you just a little understanding of one facet of it. Part of this comes from controlling the different chakras. And so you're familiar with you're familiar with the different chakras, and each of these first 5 chakras, and I'm not going to bother you with the Sanskrit, let's stick with the English, the locations. Each of them controls one of the 5 elements. So in yoga they have this idea of solid, liquid, fire, air, and ether. These are the kind of 5 basic forms of matter, if you like. And they've got there's a whole model of reality based around that. But each of these chakras controls that element in the body. So if you have complete control over the lowest chakra, it's controlling the solid factor. They're also related to the senses. So the root chakra is related to the sense of smell, the second chakra to the sense of taste, the third to sight, the fourth to touch, and the 5th to sound. So there's a whole lot of correlates along those lines. So if you control the lowest chakra, you can make your body smell like anything, like beautiful flowers or something like that. If you control the second chakra, you can you can walk on water, you can survive underwater also. If you control the third chakra, this is the one that the Tibetan Buddhists seem to exercise when they meditate in caves all night. With ice, they have a test actually for Tibetan Buddhist lamas. One of their tests is that they have to meditate just in a loincloth in an ice-filled cave with a wet sheet around them, and they have to use their body heat to dry out the sheet 3 times during the night. So not only do they have to be able to generate enough heat in their bodies through their practices and through control of the power of the heat element in their body to survive and not freeze to death, they have to actually dry out a wet sheet which is going to turn to ice within minutes by itself. So that's something that they seem to be able to do. So that's and then the 4th chakra controls the aerial factor, and we're supposed to control over that. Is supposed to give the ability of levitation. The 5th is it's called the akasha element it controls, and this is where if you control this, you're supposed to be able to know everything, past, present, and future. So there you go. And I've at least experienced bits, met people who have or read what seem to be really authentic reports of enough people to think that, yeah, this is pretty much all possible, but certainly some of the more difficult things are so rare to the point of almost being almost unheard of. Yeah, definitely the heat control one is a real thing. But there are actually 2 things happening there. And they sort of overflow. So there are something like knowing all things. That's a function of intuition, of the higher levels of the mind. Okay? Most of these other things, well, I don't really understand about the flying thing. Otherwise, as you know, I've basically failed at it for most of my life. Not that I'm really trying anymore. But here's a description of this highest power from Anandamurti's guru. He says, when that sleeping divinity was aroused, what will happen? So he's talking about the Kundalini, which is the latent spiritual power at the base of the spine. When that's aroused, what will happen? A person will acquire immense power. They'll be omniscient, that is all-knowing, they'll know everything. So this is also as a function of, in particular, the 5th chakra. Okay, so he goes into great detail about a whole lot of other powers that I'm not going to bother you with because As I said, I don't want you to be preoccupied with them. I just want to explain them a little bit. So now here's something that most people don't distinguish from mental powers. There's something called the pranendriya. So you know what prana is, right? It's the life force, the life's energy. And the chakra system is a product of the prana of the body, where the flows of prana intersect is what forms the chakras. And we draw in prana primarily through the nostrils, and it flows down and crosses at these 5 points that form the chakras. So we have this prana flowing through our bodies. In Chinese, the Chinese system, of course, they call it qi. It's the same concept. So there is this thing called indriya, so prana and indriya. Indriya is like a sense, like we have sense of sight, sense of hearing, sense of smell, sense of taste, etc. Pranendriya is like a sixth sense. We can sense other people's energy with our own prana. It's based in the heart chakra. So you can sometimes feel if someone is a good person or not. Now, this is an imperfect sense. And often it's suppressed. It depends. Actually, in indigenous people, this is much more, it functions much better. In so-called civilized societies, or I would say industrialized, modern, technological societies, we tend to lose these powers, both particularly those associated with pranendriya, but also with intuition. So things like telepathy. Telepathy was common amongst these Australian Aboriginal native people when the Europeans came there. But the more that they started to live in the cities, the less they were able to hear one another's thinking at a distance. So pranendriya is not the same thing as intuition. Intuition is purely mental. It's dealing with higher levels of mind. Pranendriya is dealing with, it's an energy sense. It's our energy body sensing energy in other ways. And it can also be not just a sense, but actually we can direct energy, and that's where genuine healing power comes from. But most of the people I meet who claim to be able to heal people can't. They're able to charge money for it, but they're not actually able to do it. And if they do something, it's usually minor and it doesn't last. So pranendriya, compared to intuition, it's more physical than mental. It's limited in range usually. It doesn't have the range of something like telepathy, which is purely psychic. Animals, a lot of animals have pranendriya. They can sense, one of the big ones is sensing earthquakes, or tsunamis. Before the terrible tsunami in Southeast Asia that killed hundreds of thousands of people, on some of the islands, entire populations of animals would go to the top of the island. And this is known, earthquakes and tsunamis, these kind of things have been, some animals seem to be able to anticipate them somehow. And I suspect that's a function of pranendriya, but I'm not sure. There's a British scientist called Rupert Sheldrake. I met him once. He's an interesting guy. He's he was also a yogi. He spent some time in India, but he's actually he says now he's an Anglican or something. But he has studied psychic phenomena for all his life, and he's written many books about it. And he's wrote a book called 7 Experiments That Will Change the World. And it's a big claim, of course. And of course, I don't think it's true. But he describes very simple experiments that you can basically do at home that will demonstrate the reality of certain psychic phenomena. But he doesn't call them psychic phenomena. He's talking about mental stuff like telepathy, animal telepathy in particular. They've been used many thousands of times to demonstrate that. The classic one is the connection between a dog and their owner, or the person that the dog imprints on. So I had a puppy, and when my puppy was very young, my puppy came, I got the puppy and she opened her eyes and saw me, and I was basically God for the rest of her life, which seemed appropriate to me. And so I had this tremendously loyal dog, and that's, of course, it's an emotional survival thing with them. But the connection, the emotional connection that dogs have with the person on whom they imprint when they're young is seems to often set up some sort of telepathic connection, so that one of the experiments that Rupert Sheldrake explained was he was in Austria, and he had a television crew with him because they wanted to get it on film and see if it worked. And there was a university professor, and she had a dog. So the dog would, was very close to her and would always come to be waiting at the door when she came home. And so they said, well, let's test this. So she went to the university with one cameraman, and they said, well, okay, at a random time of day, you decide you're going to come home. And we're going to have the other camera on the dog, and we'll see what the dog is doing when you make your decision, and compare them. And they did this repeatedly, and every time she did it, at random times, she was miles away at the university. She says, okay, I'm just out of the blue, okay, I'm going home now. It's going to be always different. Every time she said it, the dog would immediately perk up its ears, come to the door and wait for her until she came home. And there was no way anyone could... And that's just one example. They have literally done this experiment thousands of times. So that's one reason I believe in animal telepathy, because it's provable at no expense. I mean, most research costs a lot of money. These experiments you can do at home. Pranendria, so this sensing of another person's energy, is certainly a part of what is being used by traditional medical practitioners, like a Chinese doctor. If you go to them, they'll typically take your pulse, they'll look at your tongue, maybe ask you a few questions, but they can feel what's happening in your body. I met a doctor in Indonesia who was, it was like miraculous. He could tell me everything about my medical history from when I was young. Very specific, and he could do this for everybody. He had a really remarkable ability. So that's in Ayurvedic medicine, certainly Chinese medicine, which is related to that, and similar traditional medicines. This is used as a method of diagnosis. And it's not the same as intuition. There's overlap, or they work together sometimes, but this is more a physical sense. But in terms of the vital energy of the body, it's not a purely mental function. Okay. So I mentioned, this is sort of what I referred to already, this addiction that these little screens have imposed upon us, to social media and so forth, to phones, has, I believe, taken us away. It's kind of like this. When we're engaging with the world, normally, we use our senses, the indriyas in Sanskrit. You forgot that, I bet. So we're interacting with the world through these windows, right? So you've got the window of the eyes, you've got the oral window, you've got the smell window, you've got the touch window, and the taste window. You have all these windows. And you also have a pranendriya window. You can sense a kind of sense. And some animals have different types of senses. Dolphins have sonar, for example. Some animals can see or hear frequencies in the spectrum that we cannot. So they have enhanced or different senses. Okay. A question from Advaita. I'll come back to that in a minute. It's a good idea. So we normally engage with the world through our senses. So it's like we have this self, and we have a mind, and then we interact with the world through this interface, right? What we've done with all our cleverness is create another level of separation of the self from reality. So we've got one window through which we view the world, and then we have a secondary level through which we view the digital world. And it's another whole step, you could say a kind of dimensional step away from ourselves. And it's causing widespread psychological and emotional malfunction and disease and problems, especially amongst young people who grow up with these things and spend a lot of time with them, to the extent that a lot of people who understand this, in fact, most of the heads of tech companies that build these things won't allow their children to use these devices for long hours, because they know what they do to their minds. So it really is a very, very big problem. And it, by the way, it dulls our subtler senses, the pranendriya and intuition. As I said, when the as the indigenous people in Australia, the Koori people, became more city dwellers, became more involved with technology and more dependent on technology, actually, they've gradually lost these powers. Another power that they had traditionally had developed very highly was the ability to sense the presence of water underground. So divining, you've all heard of like divining sticks. The Aboriginal people were expert at this because it's a survival need. Necessity is the mother of invention, or we exercise a latent skill or talent when we have to, and they did that in that very dry environment. So, but they, if they stop living in that environment, they begin to lose that sensibility. They also use black magic a lot, by the way, for killing people. There's kind of pretty heavy stories about that, but it seems to have been dependent on belief in the system, I think. So they call it bone pointing, and there's sort of magicians will say there's a member of the tribe who've done some crime or that's punishable by death according to their tribal law. They will actually do this ritual where they point that's called bone pointing, and they actually point a bone at the person, and that person will slowly die. And they've done a lot of studies into this, and it seems to be that it's because of their belief. The person who's had the bone pointed at them, even if they don't consciously believe it, if they grew up with that tradition, on some deeper level they believe it, it works. It's not. I don't think it's really practiced now, but it was until fairly recently it was a real thing. So weird stuff. I told you weird. It's called weird. Now here's another interesting take on the effects of something, not just meditation, but this what they call spiritual training. It's a recent piece of research, and it's creating a lot of waves in the community that I'm in touch with, because I'm in touch with quite a lot of people who research this and teach it. So this study concluded that some popular forms of spiritual training, such as energy healing, aura reading, and to a lesser degree mindfulness and meditation, correlate with both narcissism and spiritual superiority. Of course, they're talking about a spiritual superiority complex, means a delusion, an internal delusion of superiority. So I thought this was fascinating because I've seen this a lot. I mean, this to me was describing this purple lady in Australia. This is her whole thing. And well, I don't know if she practiced meditation, certainly not the kind that I practice. She certainly was doing sort of energy healing, aura reading, and this kind of thing. And she was definitely narcissistic and had sort of what seemed to be trying to promote that her spiritual superiority, which was, I'm pretty sure was, I don't know if it was a total delusion, but it was flawed, to be polite about it. But it's very common. And I think this distinction here is really interesting. So they're referring to energy healing and aura reading. Okay, that's one set of methods, and then mindfulness and meditation. And they don't say what. I didn't read the whole study. I want to find out what kind of meditation they were doing, because there are a number of different types, as you know. But I thought even the little bit of this, I did read the article. There was a clear difference between the people that were doing energy healing and aura reading and the people that were doing mindfulness and meditation. But they did notice this in both groups. But to me, there's a lot of things I can extract from this, but let's just go a little further and see what we find. So yeah, power. Let's have a look. This is a famous saying. I'm sure you've all heard it. Power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. From Lord Acton, who was a British politician, diplomat fellow from some years ago. Very astute observation, and he was obviously someone in a position of power who knew people in power, and this was his conclusion. Of course, he's talking about worldly power, external power over other people, political power, economic power. He's not necessarily talking about psychic power at all. But I'm of the opinion that the same applies. And that's why my guru discouraged me and others from developing this kind of talent, if you want to call it that, or latent ability, because the tendency is for it to kind of it appeals to the ego tremendously and actually increases your feeling of separation from others because you feel superior, you feel different. It doesn't bring you closer to people. It's actually the polar opposite. The feeling of power and the superiority that tends to go with it, that it feeds, that's the corrupting influence, is like the polar opposite of love. Think about that for a minute. Okay. And that's why you get this juxtaposition. These people have power, right? Of course, this is in mythology, but I'm using these modern fantasy stories. But you can read this story of, the contrast of people who, they develop mental powers, but some of them become corrupted by it and some do not. You can find it throughout mythology. It's a completely, it's like the commonest theme in Joseph Campbell's studies of mythology from all around the world, right? So, of course, in the Star Wars universe, we have the Sith Lords and the Jedi, right? They're one is Vidya and Avidya. So Vidya means knowledge or wisdom. And Avidya in Sanskrit, the A in the front negates it. So it's ignorance or darkness, which I think describes these people pretty well. And then, of course, you have the same figure, same story. These people have tremendous power. They're effectively gods. The Maya, the Saruman and Gandalf from Lord of the Rings. They have extraordinary power. They have seemingly endless life, but one of them has become corrupted by it, and the other remains true to his mission to save the free people of the world from the domination of the Lord of the Rings. And of course, we've got these stories endlessly. We've got Harry Potter and all these others, all the Marvel stories and all the modern fantasy stories. But you see the same story being acted out through the centuries in all of our mythologies and legends as well to a great extent. So, of course, who knows who this is? That should be easy for any of you who at all like these kind of stories.
Family.
Yeah, but who was he? Why is he famous?
The creator of Marvel.
Very good. He is the father of the Marvel Universe. He just died, I think, last year. So here he is with Spider-Man in the background. So all of these characters, that whole Marvel Universe, which now the Disney owns it, they've got this like 20 films or something. But he that's all about people with powers, right? They come across them in various ways. They get bitten by spiders and struck by lightning, and some of them just mutants and all of that. So it's a lot of fun. But he has this sort of message. I mean, he feels, the message is simply that with great power comes great responsibility. And that's what they're always quoting, right? So the goodies in his story, they feel that. They feel this, I should use this power for the common good. So that's a message of love, right? Of being beyond selfishness and not power for its own sake. And then, of course, the bad people, and they've usually got their reasons. He makes some complex villains, which are fun. They tend to be self-obsessed, and they're very much into the power for its own sake. And they're addicted to exercising it and using it for domination rather than serving others. So that's, nice moral themes that come through in these stories. I love this quote. This is actually it is original, but the original idea was from Gladstone. Some old British Prime Minister said something similar, but not quite as poetically. But Jimi Hendrix was a poet as well as a great musician. So when the power of love overcomes the love of power, the world will know peace. I really feel this is kind of prophetic. It's so central to the human dilemma. This is some ideas we came up with on Sunday when I did this workshop with a group of about 120 people, and we got lots of ideas on. So the question was, what tools have we been given in our spiritual practice in this tradition that can help us to protect us from the corrupting influence of power, because we can all be subject to this to varying degrees. And everybody's got some power. I remember I told you, when I was a kid, I had my dog, right? I was the youngest son, or the youngest child, so everybody in the family was my boss. They're either a big brother, I had 3 of those, or a mum or a dad. They're all my boss, there was no question. But at least I was boss of the dog. So, everybody's got some degree of power. I do hope I exercised it kindly. I was very kind to my dog, I think. I was probably too kind to her. She liked chocolate. Chocolate's not good for dogs, but I couldn't resist giving her chocolate. So these are some of the tools that are there as a part of Ananda Marga's practice. So some of them you'll be familiar with, some of them less. Who has a favourite? Or one that they might like to explain, that they're familiar with and they'd like to explain? Come on, don't make me do all the work.
Kirtan.
Oh yeah, well, the person who wrote this,
spiritual songs.
whoever wrote this has clearly got a favourite. Yeah, so let's look back at that study where they had these energy healing, or whatever it was, and then the aura reading, and they were contrasting that with meditation and mindfulness. But there are different kinds of meditation. Some of them are just focusing on the breath, maybe focusing on a particular color, or even a mantra without a meaning, or some other idea. And that definitely increases concentration. It can bring mental stillness. It can bring a lot of the benefits that we associate with meditation. But if there is no idea of love and expansion there, I would not call it spiritual meditation. I would call it concentration. And concentration does increase power. So you can see where I'm going with this. If you infuse this deliberate orientation towards love and expansion and universal love in your meditation practice, your mind will adopt the form of its object. That's how it works. But if you don't, you'll increase your mental power, and it may go in another direction. So kirtan is the best way I know to induce that feeling of love and devotion and warmth, you could say, emotional warmth, which I think infuses the meditation with a spiritual element that protects the practitioner from getting caught up in this thing of the power that naturally comes from concentrating your mind regularly. You can't help it. If you want to meditate, you're going to get some kind of power. Your mind is going to become more powerful, more focused, more calm. You'll be able to control your emotions more. If you do it a lot, you may find that you develop some sort of charisma. People can be influenced by you. They listen to you. Now, all of that's good if it's used in the right way. But we need to be alert. And that's what some of these other practices are about. So give us another one. You have kirtan. Many of you are practicing a lot of these. I'm going to pick a couple. For me, probably, it's hard to say what are the most important, but there are 2 that jump out for me. After kirtan, yes. There are 2 others that really stand out for me as being extremely important. Well, there are more than 2 actually. I can think of about 8.
Yama and Niyama?
Yama and Niyama is definitely one of them. So yeah. What does that mean?
There's the different the ethics like ahimsa and brahmacharya.
Right. Exactly. So there are the ethical principles which are the foundation of meditation. So it's kind of like when you start meditating and applying all that energy, focus in your mind, you're lighting the fuel and taking the rocket's going to take off, and your goal is to achieve escape velocity and go across the universe, okay? But if the rocket's not pointed in the right direction, it's not going to work, okay? So the yama niyama is like the foundation that makes sure that before you apply all that energy and start moving with great speed, you're actually going in the right direction. So our guru would say that the morality or the yama niyama, that your ethics, that's the base of your spirituality, and then you build on that with your spiritual practice, your meditation, and you develop your focus, and you're pointed in the right direction, and things will go well. So I think that is quite literally fundamental. Great. Kirtan, Yama Niyama, these are the fundamentals. Another one that I think is really important is service. It's quite possible to become a selfish yogi. You know, if you spend your time just doing stuff for yourself and maybe your family, but you don't really express any love for anybody else, this is not going to be, it means you're not expanding your sphere of love at all, and you're not acting that way. It means it's not real. So service is a really important balance to to your meditation. It brings about a sort of balanced development in your personality. A lot of the others here are satsang is an important one. This is, spiritual company. It literally means, so sat means truth, sangha means community or society. So it's the community of truth seekers, people walking this path together. And that's great, because then we kind of, I've got friends who'll point out to me if I'm being kind of egocentric, or I do have that tendency, right? So it's good to have, it's not always comfortable, but it's great when someone points it out to you, because they're helping you to not become a Sith Lord. Who wants to become a Sith Lord? Not me, all right? And it comes in incremental steps. If you know the Star Wars story well, you'll remember that Darth Vader, what got him on the path of they call what's it called? I should know this. There's the dark side. Yeah, the dark side of the Force. What got him on that path was actually his adoration of his wife. He wanted to save her. He had this foresight. He saw that she was going to die. He had a vision, and he was told by the dark mentor that he could save her if he used this dark power. And that was what hooked him, was actually his affection, his very, overwhelming of, love for his wife. But it ended up, and anyway, he was being deceived. He couldn't save her. The whole thing is really sad. poor old Darth Vader. But he has this redemption story. He ends up turning it around at the last possible moment. So the other one I want to say is, again, there's so many of these are fundamental. Down on the right, see the Guru's guidance. For me, this has been tremendously important. If I didn't have someone who I felt really knew what was good for me better than I do know myself, I would have messed up 1,000 times. You need to find someone genuine, and you may not find somebody perfect, but if you can find someone that you can feel can act as a mentor to you and really help you and advise you and kind of call you out a little when it's needed, this is incredibly helpful, incredibly important. And but yes, I do want to emphasize finding someone genuine, because there's a lot of charlatans in this field, as we've mentioned. So those are a few of my favorites. There's a whole bunch of them. When we become acharyas, when we do our training as monks, we got to learn a whole bunch of rules, like 200 rules, and we get to memorize them all, and then we're supposed to follow them for the rest of our lives. So we have lots of guidelines and stuff like that. And people who may not be monks or acharyas, but the regular practitioners also, there's a lot of recommendations and guidelines that can really help you to continue to examine yourself, your motives, and become more and more self-aware. Okay, I want to know whether I addressed your question, Advaita. You said you wanted me to say something about what Anandamurti had to say about parapsychology. Is there something I missed? I mean, I've sort of alluded to that, but I don't know whether you're satisfied. Not hearing from you. Okay, I'm going to tell. But this is actually kind of relevant. So Anandamurti, that's one of my favourite pictures. Taken when he was in Taiwan in 1979. He said that mental power is 100,000 times greater than physical power. So he gave a very simple example. He said, look, human beings used to go around, if we wanted to find food, we had to go and hunt for it. And then we figured out how to farm by applying our intellect. Okay, advice is satisfied. Thank you. I've actually got something more to say about that. Summing up. So, yeah, here's that example. We used our intellect to increase our power, but to grow food and farm food. We invented instruments and plows, and then, nowadays tractors, and now you've got entire automated planting with drones, and all of this is application of the power of the intellect and the mind, the imagination, right? And it increases our ability to control our environment dramatically, thousands, hundreds of thousands of times. So that was his first point. Then he said, well, okay, that's true enough, but spiritual power is 100,000 times as great as mental power. So he makes a clear distinction between mental power and spiritual power. And under mental power, it includes, of course, intellect, but it also includes some of these, the ones that are real, things like being able to influence other people's mind with yours. That's a real thing. Being able to, maybe things like healing, these kind of so-called occult powers, psychic powers, some of them, all comes within the realm of mental power. He never called them spiritual powers. I'll say a bit more about that in a minute. But so here what he's talking about is, what is spiritual power actually? It's, the way I would describe it is, number 10 in my course, the power of love. Somebody like Jesus, he had healing powers and so forth. He could walk on the water, if legends holds it to be so. But that wasn't the important stuff. The important thing was his power of love, and what did that give him the ability to do was to inspire other people to follow in his footsteps. And thousands of years later, here we are saying, well, what would Jesus do? And that's a beautiful form of power, that power of inspiration to be as good as you can be. Because that touches, in this case, of course, literally billions of lives. But if you can, inspire others to become a better person and improve their lives, that amplifies what you could do by yourself every time you do that. So that's why he's saying spiritual power is actually much greater, because it can change people, it can inspire them to evolve to the next level of themselves. So I think that distinction is really kind of cool. And he makes that distinction again when there's this story here. So one disciple, and Karun, you've heard this story numerous times, I think. I like to hammer the point home. One disciple asked Anandamurti, I think it was one of the Dadas, one of the monks, asked him about psychic powers. They said, are these, say, if we have this ability to heal or to understand what people are thinking or something like that, is this a sign of spiritual progress? And Anandamurti became very serious. He says, no. He said, these psychic abilities have nothing to do with spirituality. And he said, the only way you can measure your spiritual progress is, some of you know this, Karun, you know this.
The circle of your love.
He used the word periphery. I like
Or
that.
periphery. Yeah.
Yeah, through the periphery of your love. So in other words, how big is your love. I mean, how wide is the expanse of the circle? How far does it reach? You know, it reminds me of this metta meditation from the Buddhists. You remember I told you about it last year. Those of you who were here, this where they have 1 million children meditate in Bangkok every year, and they're practicing a metta meditation, which means they start off feeling that they love themselves, and they really reinforce that, and then they expand that circle to maybe their family and their puppy or whoever it is, and then their friends, of course, and then to people they don't know, maybe in the neighborhood, in the city, and the whole country, and they keep expanding this circle of their love to all the living beings, and they keep expanding it. So that is the idea of where we want to go with our spiritual progress. So when you really feel that you can love everybody and all living things, everything, that's a sign of progress, if it's real, And, it really is something that comes, in my experience, with spiritual meditation, kirtan, and this whole way of viewing the world. There you go. So that's what Anandamurti had to say about that, and I agree with him. So I don't think I'm going to get to fly, except in an aeroplane. So how are we doing so far? How are you doing as far as expanding the periphery of your love? Maybe you could ask yourself that in the morning when you wake up. Any questions, thoughts, observations? Do you disagree with me? Please do. I'm happy to look at different ideas around this. What are my thoughts on empaths? Oh, interesting. So these things go in waves, I've been in this game so many years that there was a big wave of flower essences when I was in Australia, and that became a big thing. And then later on there was the alignment of some planets, and that was going to save the world, and then nothing happened, and then some other thing. So nowadays, empath seems to be a big thing. So what does empath mean? It means somebody who decides they're an empath or labels themselves an empath, to me, seems to be reassuring themselves or trying to reassure somebody else or something that they are sensitive to how other people feel. That can be a good thing. If it's some sort of way of making yourself feel that you're claiming some kind of superiority, then I think it's a problem. Because everybody's got empathy. I don't think there's such a thing as an empath, to be honest. I think there is a scale of empathy, and we're all somewhere on that scale. And some of us are very empathetic, and some days we are, and some days we aren't. Some people are particularly sensitive or empathetic, but empathy by itself is actually limited. And if you read about the psychological studies into empathy, sympathy, and compassion, what they've discovered is that empathy is more self-centered almost. I mean, you can feel what other people are feeling, perhaps to some degree, you're sensitive to it, or animals or something, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you care about it in the same way that you care about yourself. Compassion, on the other hand, is a much more evolved form. It's like empathy plus love, and it's a much more valuable and evolved form of this sensibility. So those are a few of my thoughts on empathy and empaths. I think everybody has empathy to varying degrees, but I think it's important to cultivate the feeling, to combine that with a feeling of love and affection and warmth, so that it becomes compassion, which is much more life-changing for individuals and the community. So there you go. Any other questions, thoughts? I have a couple of announcements, and I'm kind of excited about these, but I want to give you another minute. Okay, we have a question. Hello, Vita. If anything came up... Oh, okay, we can chat. Yeah, parapsychology. I've got there's thoughts I've had about it, things that Barbara's written about it. We can talk about it sometime for sure. It's really interesting. One of the weird things about parapsychology, there's been so much research into mental powers over the last 50, 60 years. And very little of it has been able to come up with anything really so solid that it can't be refuted or attributed to placebo influence, etc. It's a bit weird, but some of it has been, particularly some of the research out of Russia. But from what I've read, as far as telepathy, for example, goes, it seems that it's easier to prove animal telepathy than to prove human telepathy. Which I thought means telepathy between animals and other animals, and humans and animals. Seems to be easier to really confirm that than to confirm telepathy between people, which I think is really strange. And I don't understand why. But anyway. Maybe it's because the refutation is stronger about human telepathy. I'm not sure if it's even how solid the research is.